Hey there, all you beautiful off-Broadway babies. Welcome to Broadway by Ghostlight. I'm Mark Bonanni, and today I am breaking down a modern cult classic. I've done several breakdowns on this channel, be sure to check them out after this, but today's subject is the channel's first off-Broadway musical, the most recent show I've covered, and definitely the darkest.
You have my undivided attention.
Today, we are sinking our teeth into Bat Boy the Musical. But before we dive into the melodramatic mayhem of the early 2000s musical, first we have to explore the history of Bat Boy himself. His story begins in a cave many miles to the south in 1992. Leading an expedition into some caves just east of the Shenandoah Mountains in West Virginia, Professor of Zoology Ron Dillon made a startling discovery deep in the caverns.
He was obviously terrified when we found him. He started to panic, started clawing and scratching and screaming like a demon. I had to tranquilize him to bring him out of the cave.
Alright, before you go spelunking for Bat Children, let's briefly explore the real history of Bat Boy. Bat Boy was the invention of artist Dick Culpa and writer Bob Lind for the popular supermarket tabloid Weekly World News. If you're like me of a certain age now, you'll remember the crazy off-the-wall headlines of rags like the Weekly World News or the National Enquirer in the supermarket checkout lines. But these were all, pardon the expression, fake news. Bat Boy made a splash on the cover of Weekly World News on June 23, 1992, and became their second best-selling issue of all time. It was all fake, though fairly impressive given that in 1992, photo editing software was nowhere near as sophisticated as today. I mean, look at him.
He's so ugly! I love him!
Bat Boy caused a sensation and became sort of a mascot for the tabloid. Throughout the years, Bat Boy has been captured numerous times, always escaping. He's gone to space, bitten Santa Claus, dated celebrities, and tried out for American Idol.
Oh, man, dude. This has been one of the worst days we've ever had. And you are probably the worst we've had today.
But most importantly for us today, he's inspired an over-the-top musical bursting with heart, dark humor, and a whole lot of blood. The idea for the musical sprang from the place we all were when Bat Boy first peered into our souls with his animal gaze, the supermarket checkout line. Friends and members of the Actors Gang, an experimental theater company in Los Angeles, Keith Farley and Brian Fleming were in the market checkout line when they spotted the infamous Bat Boy staring back at them from the Weekly World News. They laughed and began making up stories and songs for this Bat Boy, feeling quite strongly that he should sing.
Logical.
The more they worked on it, the more substantial the piece became. Soon it was clear that they had something, but needed a proper songwriter to move forward. In fall of 1996, the pair were working the concession stand at the Actors Gang's latest production, a play with music called Euphoria, all about drug use throughout the ages, when the composer of Euphoria, Laurence O'Keefe, came out at intermission, and the friends asked if he'd be interested in writing the music for their show. They explained their story and then showed O'Keefe a picture of Bat Boy. Laurence O'Keefe reportedly said, "That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. I'll do it." Laurence O'Keefe is probably best known today for having written the scores to the musical versions of Legally Blonde and Heathers. For what it's worth, I think Legally Blonde, Heathers, and Bat Boy would make one hell of an in-rep season for some theater company out there. The actual score for Bat Boy was whipped up in a mere month and a half, according to Mr. O'Keefe, before the musical had its world premiere at the Actors Gang's Theater on Halloween night 1997. Directed by co-author Keith Farley and choreographed by Derek LaSala, the show starred Deven May in the title role and Caitlin Hopkins as Meredith Parker, Bat Boy's sort of adopted mother. The show was nominated for several LA Ovation Awards, with Deven May winning Best Actor in a Musical for his starring role as Batboy. The authors submitted for and won the 1999 Richard Rodgers Development Award, allowing several staged readings to be held through 1999 and 2000. The musical finally bowed off-Broadway at the Union Square Theater, no longer in existence sadly, on March 21st, 2001. The musical again starred Deven May and Caitlin Hopkins from the first production, now joined by Sean McCourt, who would go on to create the role of Elphaba's father in Wicked, and Broadway favorite Kerry Butler.
Everything about her is terrific!
Miss Butler has been seen in the original Broadway cast of Hairspray, Xanadu, Mean Girls, Beetlejuice, and many more. Batboy was now directed by Scott Schwartz and choreographed by Chris Catelli, who would go on to win Tony Awards for Newsies and choreograph the best TV show in the world. Why, yes, I do have many Schmigadoon breakdowns for you to watch after this. Oh. The show was also orchestrated and music directed by none other than Alex Lacamoire. The music man extraordinaire, of course, is responsible for the sounds of some of the best loved modern musicals like In the Heights, Dear Evan Hansen, and Hamilton.
Never heard of it.
Now, we are about to fly into this insane plot breakdown of this creepy, campy musical, but I wanted to address something that is integral to the success of this show, and that is the style. And that's style with a capital S.
Oh, I know style. I am style.
The Actors Gang, the home of the musical's authors and the show's first home, is a major believer and practitioner of the style. The style is derived from commedia dell'arte. I won't give you a whole history lesson on it here, but basically the style is highly presentational, broad, high emotions, but played very serious and truthful. Early director and co-author Keith Farley and stars Deven May and Caitlin Hopkins really delved into the take it so seriously it's funny but also hurts, as co-author Brian Fleming put it. As you're about to see, or hear rather, the show is very dramatic, seemingly dead serious, but the characters and situations are so over the top you can't help but laugh. So during the breakdown you may be thinking in certain moments, this is a musical comedy? But it's all about the style.
It's a method of science. Je ne sais quoi.
The show can be outrageous and slapstick in one breath, deeply cutting and sad in another, and terrifying in the next. There is still lots of fun and fascinating info on the show, like how it fared off-Broadway, why it didn't run nearly as long as it should have, and info on the much revised London production and subsequent development and attempts to get it to Broadway. But first, let's fly into the plot of this tabloid-inspired cult musical. There's also a bit of a trigger warning for the show. There is lots of violence, and in Act 2, I don't want to spoil anything, but there is a trigger warning for sexual assault. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Batboy. The show opens in darkness. We are deep in a cavern outside the small town of Hope Falls, West Virginia, population 500. 3 teenage siblings, Rick, Ron, and Ruthie Taylor, are cave spelunking, rappelling into the black space. They wonder where they are, and Rick tells them they're deeper than anyone's ever gone before.
That's what she said.
They land on the stage and do what any red-blooded American teenagers would do in an untouched facet deep in the earth. They pull out a bong and start smoking. The lighter is the only light for a while until Ron turns on the light of his miner's helmet to explore the surroundings. Suddenly, the light crosses the path of a strange creature and it lets out a shriek. Ron freaks out, telling his friends he found a cave monster. Ruthie and Rick, of course, say there's no such thing as a cave monster, but the light catches the sight of the creature again, startling everyone. Eventually, they find and corner the poor creature, who stands with its back to the audience. The group takes a closer look at the naked, almost human being and decide that it's some sort of bat boy.
A bat?
They mean Batboy no harm, but when Ruthie tries to approach him to offer some Fritos, the frightened Batboy attacks Ruthie, biting her, and the brothers defend her and pummel the creature. All mercy is gone, and Ron angrily stomps on the Bat Boy's head. Blackout. The company then enter and sing Hold Me Bat Boy.
He was dragged from his home and thrown down at the edge of a coal mining town.
They stripped him of his dignity. They beat him like a gong. And he was kicked repeatedly. And that was wrong. So wrong. Oh, the bad boy. Touch the bad boy. Touch him. To the love. Love the bad boy. Save the bad boy. Maybe all turn out all right.
I love that opening song. During the song, there are a few short scenes in between the choruses. First, Rick and Ron bring the Bat Boy to the town sheriff, tied up in a sack. Next, a few of the men in town have heard that someone caught the storied Bat Boy, once thought as an urban legend. They ask what he's going to do with it, and he says he'll take it to Dr. Parker, the town veterinarian. He says he's a good doctor, I'm sure he'll put the creature down. Next, the sheriff runs into some townswomen and he tells them he's taking the Bat Boy to Dr. Parker's to be put down, which the women say seems like such a waste of resources.
Seems a downright shame.
Couldn't the creature be raised to rustle cows or something? Another lady suggests that they charge admission to view the creature, but when they sneak a peek inside the bag, the ladies scream and the sheriff goes on his way. In town, we are now at the Parker home, where Shelley Parker and her mother Meredith are cleaning. Shelley is desperate to call her boyfriend Rick, one of the teenage spelunkers from the opening, but her mother won't have it. She says he'll think about you more if you don't call him. Shelley says, Mom, Rick already knows that I like him. To which her mother responds, don't talk like a slut, Shelley, and gives her daughter a dire speech culminating in the wages of sin is death, sweetheart. That's all I'm saying.
Yikes.
So yeah, I'd say it's a more conservative household. Suddenly, the sheriff arrives at the Parker home with the Bat Boy in handcuffs and a hood over its head that someone has written on it, Bites. The Bat Boy gets free and runs aimlessly around the house, so the sheriff pistol whips the Bat Boy and knocks him out. Shelley, Meredith, and the sheriff sing Christian Charity.
I didn't know where else to take him.
Mom, Shelley, quiet.
Can't go to jail, he's underage.
Mom, Shelley, quiet.
Folks up at the med school bet they carve him up or bake him. I'd send the FBI a page, but I don't think we're at that stage. So, here he is, folks, he's all yours. Couldn't leave him out of doors, creeping on all fours. We could always shoot him, but that don't seem right to me. And I can't rid myself of my Christian charity.
Shelley is very much intrigued by this Bat Boy. The sheriff warns Mrs. Parker that the boy is pretty feisty, and she says they can handle it, that her husband has some cages around and they can use those. A bit later now, Bat Boy is in a large cage, but not happy about it. He crashes around, clawing at the bars and wailing incessantly. Shelley is yelling at him to shut up, but her mother says he's probably just hungry. She places a full cooked chicken in his cage. Bat Boy sniffs it a little bit, gets on all fours, and then begins growling at the meal until Meredith takes it away. Meredith and Shelley sing Ugly Boy.
Such an ugly boy.
He's just different.
Like a stinky, bony rat.
Well, you wanted to keep him.
I didn't know he looked like that.
Shelley.
Well, look at him.
Oh my, it's going to be quite a storm.
Stupid starving freak.
Shelley, that's not nice.
Doesn't have the sense to eat.
We just haven't figured out what he needs.
Dropping dead right at my feet.
Shelley!
The two decide they have to name the creature. Shelley suggests Bat Boy or Ugly for his names, but Mrs. Parker settles on Edgar. She leaves to find some other food for Edgar, and the doorbell rings. It's Rick, which Shelley is overjoyed about. But Rick has heard that the sheriff left the Bat Boy in the Parker's care. He sees the caged Edgar and is floored that it would still be alive after sending his sister Ruthie to the hospital with bite wounds. Rick and Shelley taunt Edgar and sing What You Wanna Do.
Hey there, little freak, you remember me? We were never introduced properly. Hey, you gonna cry? You don't look so tough by the light of day, but we ain't gonna murder you right away. First we're gonna buy you lots of fancy clothes, make you clip your toes, watch you walk around in makeup and pantyhose.
We're gonna take you back out by the railroad track and leave your body for the dogs as a midnight snack.
Your papa was a pig,
Your mama was a snake.
we're gonna snap you like a twig and dump you in the lake.
We're gonna chain your arm to an atomic bomb and make you take your grandmama to the senior prom.
Shelley is totally on board to tease Edgar, but as the song goes on, Rick becomes more sadistic and threatening, pulling a Bowie knife on Edgar until Shelley finally calls for her mom. Mrs. Parker kicks Rick out, who leaves unhappily, and she consoles her now crying daughter. Batboy Edgar passes out in his cage, and there's a loud thunderclap and the power goes out. Mrs. Parker tells Shelley to get ready for bed and she exits. As she begins to light some candles, she sings A Home for You, during which Edgar begins to sing along.
We're not here to harm you or make you feel ashamed. You can make mistakes here and you won't be blamed. So show us how to help you, and if we pull you through, then we will find a home for you.
The next scene is at the Hope Falls Slaughterhouse. Maggie, the mayor, has called a town meeting. First order of business is that Reverend Billy Hightower will be bringing his tent revival and barbecue to Hope Falls this spring, which the town members are thrilled about. If there's one thing Southern towns and theater nerds have in common, they love a good revival. But then the mayor reveals why she's called the meeting in the slaughterhouse. She says, look at the meat hooks, they're empty, and she wants to know why. Some of the not-so-jolly ranchers explain that by West Virginia law, a cow has to be a certain weight to be slaughterable, and none of the cows in town quite make the cut, no pun intended. But another town member doesn't buy it. She says she went to one of the ranches the other day, and not only were all the cows bone thin, but there were certainly less of them than there should have been. The ranchers all admit that there's been 22 dead cows recently.
That kinda seems like a lot.
Concerned, the mayor and townsfolk try to figure out what could be causing this and sing the very funny Another Dead Cow.
I checked my bovine manual and I find no definition. Even this revised edition does not mention malnutrition.
The seed out of a hat can cough, there I drowned in the feeding trough.
Why would the Lord want to carry them all? Dang, we got another dead cow and the rent is overdue. We're facing poverty. Got another dead cow and we're up to 22.
Better make that 23.
Sweet Jesus, now I'm petrified.
They're gonna repossess my double wide.
When someone at the meetings mentions the little bat boy that was found as a suspect, everyone seems to agree that that must be what's happening. But all are confident that Dr. Parker is a good man and will surely kill the creature. Now, back at the Parker home, where a visibly drunk Mr. Parker enters with 2 dead geese strung around his neck, a shotgun in one hand, and a large hunting knife in the other. He stumbles around talking to himself when he knocks into the big cage. Figuring it must be another stray dog he's been sent to put down, he takes a candle over to examine it, and is of course shocked at what he finds. He rushes to his doctor's bag, takes a big swig of a flask hidden inside, and grabs his tape recorder. He examines the bat boy and ultimately decides to put whatever it is out of its misery. He takes a syringe out of his bag, fills it with a pink liquid, and is right about to inject poor Edgar when his wife Meredith enters and begs him not to. Dr. Parker is resistant, of course. The townsfolk will go crazy, he says, if he can't save their cattle but saves the bat boy. He decides there's no way around it and goes to pierce Bat Boy's neck. Mrs. Parker falls to her knees, begging and pleading with her husband to spare the poor boy. Doc is obviously upset and asks where all this love in her heart came from. He demands to know who she loves. She says, "Of course, you. I'm your wife." But the doctor says she hasn't been a wife to him in a long time. Clearly, the couple's love life is as dry and anemic as the town's cows. Meredith seems to suggest that if the doctor doesn't destroy the boy, then she would indulge her husband's desires for carnal relations. Overjoyed at the prospect, the doc grabs his wife and sings "Dance With Me, Darling."
Dance with me, darling, we haven't danced since I don't know when. Do you remember that song, Meredith? Dance with me, darling, won't you embrace me? Kiss me in case we don't meet again. I've heard a rumor, barely a whisper, claiming that we were through. So dance with me, darling, show them that it's not true.
As they dance, Mrs. Parker does her best to plaster on a smile while trying to get the syringe away from her husband. When the Bat Boy moans, Dr. Parker returns his attention to him. The married couple seem to make a tenuous deal. He'll keep the Bat Boy if his wife gives it up, so to speak.
Men are pigs.
She leaves, and Dr. Parker continues singing with his now new pal, Edgar.
Surely it's more than moonlight and music. Surely it's more than wine. So dance with me, darling. Show them that you're still mine.
He cradles the sickly creature in his arms while fetching the basin and his dead geese. The doctor extinguishes the candle, and then the song takes a horrifying turn. In a flash of light, we see the doctor slash the bird's throat. Another flash of light, and he drains the blood from the birds into the basin. Another flash of light, he forces the screeching Bat Boy's face into the basin. Another flash of light, the Bat Boy comes up, covered in blood, and screeches like an animal. When the power returns and the lights come back on, Dr. Parker finishes the song, and we see that Bat Boy is tired, but does look noticeably healthier. The next scene takes place at the hospital in Ruthie Taylor's room. Ruthie is in bed and in pain with her brothers and mother by her side. The doctor comes in and tells them that other than her blood oddly not clotting, she'll be just fine. The sheriff enters the room, and Mrs. Taylor and her boys give the sheriff a piece of their minds. They can't believe that creature was allowed to live. What if it gets out again and attacks one of them?
I feel very attacked!
The sheriff tries to explain that he doesn't believe it's an actual Bat Boy, but Ruthie starts to moan in pain, and Mrs. Taylor sings her a lullaby.
Sleep, little Ruthie, baby, no one's gonna hurt you. Sheriff's gonna have that little freak destroyed. Or if he's a coward and he won't protect my children, Mama's gonna get the sheriff unemployed. Sleep, little Ruthie, baby, don't you fear no bad boy. Mama's gonna hunt him down and bring him here. Then you can skin him and wear him as a jacket, and we'll string a necklace with a dried bat ear.
The next morning, bright and early at the Parker residence, Mrs. Parker is sitting with Edgar, whom she has dressed now, at the kitchen table. She is attempting to teach Edgar how to speak. Edgar eventually is able to repeat words like hello and boy. Thrilled, Mrs. Parker continues to teach him and sings "I'll show you a thing or two."
I'll show you a thing or two.
Hey.
I'll teach you to name it.
Name it.
Sure, it's tough, but you'll tame it.
Tame it.
You'll soon complete it. Oh, wait! Don't eat it.
Oh.
I'll show you the way it's done. Then I'll leave it to you. And what do you know? You may show me a thing or two.
Time passes, and Shelley enters and inquires about Edgar's process, and the song continues to showcase Edgar's development.
Edgar is coming along nicely. We were just watching Masterpiece Theater on PBS.
How do you do?
How do you do?
Lovely, and you?
Lovely, and you?
Won't you sit down?
Won't you sit down?
Don't mind if I do.
Don't mind if I do.
More time passes, and Dr. Parker comes home and sees Edgar coming along very nicely, but still is struggling.
How is Edgar coming along?
This week's been a little rocky, dear.
We're trying flashcards.
Champs-Élysées,
Parthenon,
Great White Way,
Everglades.
Berlin Wall, Autobahn, Carnegie Hall,
Icecapade,
Pentagon,
Golden Gate.
Amazon, Rio Grande, Taj Mahal,
Empire State.
Wailing Wall,
Disneyland.
Dr. Parker takes Edgar aside, testing out a theory. He gives Edgar a rat, which Edgar bites the head off and drinks its blood. That seems to have done the trick, and Bat Boy rapidly evolves.
I will discuss Copernicus, who ruined all our fun and showed we're just a ball of dust that limps around the sun. Which brings me then to Darwin, when he bent us out of shape, as he began to prove that man is nephew to an ape. We were annoyed when Dr. Freud declared it's not a soul, it is your blind subconscious mind that's always in control. But I submit that any twit, if he has eyes to see, can seize his fate, self-educate, and turn out just like me.
More time passes, and Edgar, now in cap and gown, has passed his high school equivalency exam, and the song finishes.
And won't they be impressed? I'll show them a thing or two.
I was dirty and rowdy, even dressed a bit dowdy. But now say howdy to a super cloudy.
It's now spring in Hope Falls, and Maggie the mayor has called an emergency town meeting at Town Hall to prepare for the upcoming big tent revival happening that weekend. The main point of contention is Batboy. The sheriff asks Dr. Parker to take it away for the weekend, but Dr. Parker tries to assure everyone that Edgar isn't the same wild creature that was brought to his doorstep months earlier. He's practically a member of the family now, he says. But the people won't hear of it. One man says that Ruthie Taylor is still in the hospital and not getting better, and they all still blame Batboy for the cow plague situation happening as well. When the sheriff tries to again explain that there's no evidence that Batboy and the cow plague are related, the man named Bud says that if the sheriff doesn't start whistling the right tune, he might just run against him for sheriff next election. That does indeed change the sheriff's tune, and he, the mayor, and the rest of the townfolk demand the Batboy be taken away for the weekend to not ruin the big revival, and they all sing a reprise of Christian Charity.
It's not about these dumb elections.
Never said it was.
Don't want the cart before the horse.
Of course, nobody does.
But some of my constituents claim he's skulking through their kitchens, and soon I may have no recourse but to enforce the law with deadly force.
So there it is, dark spelled out plain.
So are we clear?
You will take no action that could derail this train.
You hear?
You should just be grateful we don't hang him from a tree.
Yeah.
So don't you go testing our Christian charity.
Dr. Parker says that, though it'll break his wife's heart, he will make sure Edgar does not attend the revival. The town is thrilled that Dr. Parker is showing some
Christian charity and some dang sense.
Back at the Parker home, Shelley and a now well-dressed Edgar share a sweet moment while she teaches him to slow dance. In the kitchen, Dr. Parker has broken the news about the revival to his wife, who is severely disappointed, but agrees to send Edgar away for the weekend. They come out to the dining room where the now very well-spoken Edgar serves the family tea. Edgar, who speaks with a slightly British accent now thanks to the BBC language tapes he's been learning from,
Pitspot, Albert Hall, Meat and Two Veg, Big Ben,
says that he just read in the paper about Reverend Billy Hightower's tent revival meeting that weekend, and as he's just finished reading the Bible for the second time, would love to attend. Shelley is thrilled, and Edgar sees it as a sort of coming out party in the Southern sense, that is. But Mrs. Parker says that Mr. Parker is going to take him camping that weekend. Edgar insists, but ends up finding out that the town has been saying cruel things about him and that they are afraid of him. Edgar sings a reprise of A Home for You.
But I'm not here to harm them, I only want to learn. They all walk in sunlight, I deserve a turn. I want to know my neighbors, I'm not some garden gnome. Why can't I make this world my home?
Mr. Parker says that it's out of the question for Edgar to go to the revival, but Edgar persists, telling his family that they might as well still be keeping him in a cage. Mrs. Parker starts to soften, saying once the town meets him, they'll change their minds. But Dr. Parker puts his foot down. He'll be humiliated if he breaks his promise to the council. But when he says that now none of them are going to the revival, Mrs. Parker says that he can stay home, but herself, Shelley, and Edgar will be attending. Dr. Parker tries to argue, but his wife ignores him, instead assuring Edgar that she loves him. Hurt and angry, Mr. Parker grabs his wife's arm, and Edgar immediately goes savage and attacks Dr. Parker, pinning him to the ground. He's about to take probably a fatal neck bite, but Mrs. Parker stops him. Mrs. Parker cradles Edgar in her arms, kissing him and reassuring him everything will be okay and that she loves him. Mr. Parker now feels he sees the situation clearly. He feels deeply, deeply betrayed. He appears to change his tune though, telling Mrs. Parker and Edgar that it'll be fine and everything will work out.
Ominous.
He says tomorrow he's got a bit of work to do in the lab in the morning, but then he'll meet the whole family there at the revival afterwards. Mrs. Parker is overjoyed and tells Mr. Parker it's time for him to give Edgar his medicine. Mr. Parker tries to go in for an embrace with his wife, but she turns around and gives Edgar a motherly kiss and leaves. Mr. Parker then turns his attention to Edgar. He asks if he's hungry, and Edgar begins to cry. Edgar explains that he's so hungry, but in the Bible, God says to Noah, "Blood shall ye not eat." Mr. Parker says, well, that seems pretty clear. Do you think you can stop? Edgar says that, yes, maybe he can. And the doc says, well, maybe you can. It's all just a matter of willpower. As he's saying this, however, Dr. Parker reaches into his doctor bag and pulls out a live rabbit.
Oh, no.
He says that this is a good test for Edgar. Try to resist. Use Psalm 23, which is the psalm now forever associated in my mind with Coolio.
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Edgar begins to recite the psalm while Dr. Parker pulls a syringe out of his bag. He stands behind Edgar and sings Comfort and Joy.
I got a spade and a burlap sack, and there's a hole in the yard out back. But if I fill it, she'll ask me why. So I've got one thing to do before you die. Wait, she will see what you are. I will win back my bride. She herself will decide to get rid of the boy. She'll admit she was wrong. She'll return before long. She'll be singing a song full of comfort and joy.
During the song, Mrs. Parker tells Shelley the good news, and we see the townsfolk preparing for the big revival.
Boy, that preacher's a pro. He's a heck of a show.
Just like Siegfried and Roy.
Moving comfort and joy. So if nothing goes wrong, yes, if nothing goes wrong, Lord, if nothing goes wrong, we'll have comfort and joy, comfort and joy.
Then we see Edgar sitting at the table with the rabbit. He sings,
Please won't you change the way I am, or prove I'm human underneath? Or if you just don't give a damn, you could at least get rid of me. If I can't prove it wrong, show me where I belong. For our hunger's so strong, he'll solve comfort and joy.
The song builds until we see Dr. Parker enter Ruthie Taylor's hospital room. Ruthie asks the doctor why he's there, but Dr. Parker just pulls out the syringe. He says, it's not me, Ruthie. It's the Bat Boy that's doing this to you.
Don't worry, Ruthie. The Bat Boy will pay for what he's done to you. We're all going to miss you very much.
Dr. Parker then injects Ruthie with the syringe. She begins to violently convulse until she finally lays still, dead. Edgar at the table bites into the rabbit. As the blood starts to spray, blackout. End of Act 1. Intermission! This is a great time to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any future breakdowns and other content. And if you're enjoying this video so far and want it to succeed, hitting that like button goes such a long way to help. But the show will be starting any minute now, so there we go. Time to take our seats for Act 2.
And now we return to Act 2.
We are at Reverend Billy Hightower's tent revival. The Reverend sings a joyful noise to the downtrodden townspeople.
Oh, the sheep has returned to the fold, and the prodigal son has come in from the cold. So
The Reverend continues the sermon and asks, "Who wants to be saved? Who wants to be healed?" To the crowd's amazement and horror, Edgar steps forward asking to be healed. The Reverend senses something dark in him, a hunger, he says. He asks Edgar if he's ready for the healing, and Edgar bursts out in tears that he is. The Reverend lays his hand on Edgar's head and closes his eyes. He says he can feel someone in the room who does not want this boy to receive the healing. Edgar looks out into the crowd. He says, "I know you hate me, but I have to believe it's because you don't know me." He sings, "Let Me Walk Among You." Here is some footage of Deven May singing that song in the original Off-Broadway production.
Let me walk among you. Let me show my grace. I can learn to live with you. I can earn my place. I will move a mountain. Your wish is my command. And someday you may want to shake my hand.
It works, and the townspeople accept Edgar into the fold. They all sing a reprise of A Joyful Noise.
Praise God, the sheep has returned to the fold. The prodigal son has come in from the fold.
So like the prophets were told in the days of old, make a joyful noise, my soul.
But as the joy is about to continue outside for the big barbecue, a visibly drunk Dr. Parker enters and tells the crowd he's got terrible news to share with everyone.
Terrible news, folks. The worst tragedy of our time.
He tells them he made a startling discovery about Edgar, and that he went to the hospital to check Ruthie's wound for confirmation, but she was already dead. He goes on to say that it was an infection caused by Edgar's bite, and that Edgar is deadly not only to all of them, but their cattle as well. As the crowd murmurs in shock, Mrs. Parker tries to console Edgar, saying it must be some kind of mistake, but Mr. Parker says he's already called the Institute to come take Edgar away. Mrs. Parker is incensed, and Mr. Parker tries to calm her down, calling her his sweetheart and saying their love will get them through. But Mrs. Parker wants nothing to do with him. She tries to reason with the increasingly loud crowd, begging for them to see that Edgar is not the wild animal he was when he first was brought into town and bit Ruthie.
I'll tell you something right now. I know Edgar, and that wasn't Edgar.
But before long, Rick and Ron Taylor, along with their mother, burst into the tent and they demand revenge. Rick tries to go after Edgar, but some of the men stop him. In the melee, the Taylors scream at Edgar for being a murderer. Edgar tries to plead with the crowd that he didn't mean to hurt anyone. The townsfolk call for the sheriff to do something, but the sheriff isn't sure how to proceed. Shelley yells at her boyfriend Rick to stop it, and Rick takes out a pistol and fires it into the air. The sheriff draws his pistol on Rick, but Rick tells everyone to shut up. He's made his decision. He goes to execute the Bat Boy when Shelley stands between Rick and Edgar. Rick roughly shoves Shelley out of the way, which causes Edgar to go feral again, and he knocks Rick down and bites him on the neck. When Edgar lifts his face up, it's covered in blood. Everyone gasps and several flee. Edgar escapes out of the tent and into the woods. Mrs. Parker takes Shelley by the hand and rushes off. The few people left in the tent go towards the clearly in pain Rick, but Dr. Parker tells them to clear back. While Dr. Parker approaches Rick to seemingly investigate the bite, he takes his syringe out of his bag and injects some fluid into Rick's neck. Rick begins to calm down, but then starts to convulse and dies just like his sister.
This is kind of dark.
Mrs. Taylor and Ron wail with grief over another family loss, and that seals it for the town. They want that freak Bat Boy dead.
Dead. Totally dead. Way dead.
Out on a winding road through the woods, Mrs. Parker and Shelley are trying to find Edgar and figure out what they're going to do next. They make a plan to run away, and they sing 3-Bedroom House. Here is some footage of Caitlin Hopkins and Kerry Butler in the original cast performing that number.
So we're gonna post on this box, and we're gonna change all the locks, and we're gonna
Shelley then confesses to her mother that she loves Edgar and wants to marry him and be with him forever. But Mrs. Parker says, no, don't say that. Never say that again. It's hideous. It's not right. Shelley is shocked by this prejudice and tells her mom that she's just like everyone else. Mrs. Parker tries to tell Shelley that she doesn't understand, but Shelley runs off into the woods as well. Further in the woods in a clearing, Shelley finds Edgar. She tells him that the town is after him and they need to run away.
Got to get out of here.
Their hands briefly touch and it's one of those "aww" moments. And then suddenly, and go with me on this, the god Pan enters with all the forest creatures. Pan? And they sing Children, Children.
Oh, children, children, don't be scared. The moon is up and we're all prepared. Children, take a look around. We're on sacred ground. And what we thought was lost at last is found.
During the song, Pan tells the young couple to go get undressed and they exit stage to do so, while the animals on stage have sort of a brief orgy.
And it just got weird.
Then the now nude couple, save for a few leaves properly placed a la Adam and Eve, enter again, and Pan performs sort of a pagan forest wedding for them. In another part of the forest, Ron is out hunting for the Bat Boy to avenge his sister and brother. It suddenly hits him that if the Bat Boy feeds off blood, he's probably hiding at the slaughterhouse and runs off. At the slaughterhouse, Ron searches for Edgar, throwing things about, making a ruckus. Outside the slaughterhouse, Daisy, one of the townsfolk, hears the noise and figures it must be the Bat Boy and radios the sheriff, who tells her he's on his way. Mrs. Taylor enters first, though, with torch in hand. When Daisy tells her they've got the Bat Boy trapped inside, Mrs. Taylor blindly seeks her revenge. She approaches the door to the slaughterhouse, yells for the Bat Boy to burn in hell,
Bat Boy.
and throws her torch inside, which bursts into flames, and we hear a pained scream inside. The sheriff, the doctor, and other townsfolk approach in shock at the burning building, and soon a crisp and smoky Ron exits the barn and collapses. Dr. Parker goes to the boy with syringe in hand, but there's no need. Ron is already dead. Mrs. Taylor lets out a wail and tells the sheriff that the Bat Boy has to pay for all he's done. The tension in the crowd is building, and the sheriff asks Dr. Parker to try to calm them down. But Dr. Parker does the opposite and whips the mob into a frenzy, while almost spilling his secret in the song Kill the Bat Boy, which isn't on the original cast recording, but is on the original London cast recording.
He will show no mercy. His wrath will spare no one. More blood will be spilt. Hunger has increased. Nothing left of guilt. Beast has been released. Damn the world of men. Everyone will pay. I shall kill again. That's what he would say.
Back in the clearing in the woods, Edgar and Shelley, partially dressed, lay cuddling. Shelley asks Edgar how he feels, and he tells her he feels complete, but also hungry. Edgar then feels he must confess his thirst for blood, but before he can, Shelley tells him she already knows, and she offers Edgar her arm and tells him it's proof she loves him, and the two sing Inside Your Heart.
Now you're scared, you're in need. Clearly someone has to bleed. I'll repay all you gave. I will give you what you crave. Let me prove I love you. Let me become part of you. I see no better way to start. Now I can live inside your heart.
They confess their love for each other, and as Edgar goes to bite her arm, Mrs. Parker enters and screams for them to stop. No! The two try to tell Mrs. Parker that they're in love, but Mrs. Parker is horrified. She says it can never happen. It's an abomination. The more the kids push, the harder Mrs. Parker denounces the relationship. Edgar has made his mind up to be with Shelley and decides he'll do whatever is necessary and lunges at Mrs. Parker, knocking her down. As Edgar bares his fangs at her, Mrs. Parker finally makes the confession that she is Edgar's mother, which would make Shelley his sister.
Well, that's fine, but I don't see how that affects...
The young pair recoil from each other in confusion and shame. The sound of hooves begin to grow louder, and the mob gets closer, and Edgar runs off into the night. Shelley cannot believe what has been confessed and opens her mouth to scream, but all the audience hears is the sound of an animal being murdered. Lights come up on the mouth of the cave where Edgar was first discovered when he enters screaming, holding the severed head of a cow. Covered in blood, Edgar kneels and, to the severed head, sings Apology to a Cow.
I'm sorry, friend, I have to. I know it's rude. I shouldn't work my problems out with food. I'm sorry, pal, I've got to. It's either me or you. Fight or be beaten. Eat or be eaten. Look what it makes me do. It's stronger than it was. And this is what the bad child does.
During the song, the hunger and hurt and anger grows, and Edgar embraces his animalistic bat boy self.
No, I'm not here to harm you. I only want to kill. You shall have your monster. I shall drink my fill. At last I am embracing my bloody destiny. Dear Mom and Dad, this face will be the last thing that you ever see. Revenge will be a home for me. For me.
Sidebar, I think that's maybe the 15th or 16th show tune to end in For Me. For me! For me. For me! For me. I'm not mad at it though. As Bat Boy feeds on the severed cow head, Dr. Parker, Ron, and Ned, one of the farmers, quietly enter. Ned recognizes the cow's head as belonging to his beloved Gertie, and the men aim their shotguns at Edgar. But Edgar seems to know they're there. He turns to Dr. Parker and says, "Hello, Father." But Dr. Parker tells him, "You are no son of mine." Edgar looks ready to strike, and the men look ready to shoot. The sheriff enters and tells everyone to stand down. The sheriff asks Edgar what he's doing, and he says he's going to kill his father, which, again, Dr. Parker denies being. During all this, the townsfolk trickle in and all call for Edgar to be killed. Mrs. Parker and Shelley enter, and Mrs. Parker begs everyone to leave her son alone.
Your son?
Her son?
The crowd is stunned and hubbubbing, but Mrs. Parker has had enough. She tells her husband it's time to tell everyone the truth. He agrees, saying, "I should have done what you told me to do the day he was born." With Edgar and Shelley watching from the side, we flash back to a fateful night several years before. While explaining their story, the Parkers speak directly to the audience. Now wearing lab coats, Mrs. Parker explains that she was once her husband's assistant and he was an up-and-coming veterinarian. And they once loved each other dearly, though were still chaste and waiting for marriage.
No ding ding without a wedding ring.
Not even kissing with tongue, they say. Mr. Parker was working on developing a pheromone treatment for cows, designed to be rubbed into the hide of a cow to sexually arouse the bulls, thus increasing the birth rate in cattle, but had found no success. In desperation, into the bovine mixture, he began adding other species, some rare, some endangered, and some human. The result was more powerful and more universal than they had even planned. Then one night in the lab, the disaster happened. Meredith accidentally spilled some of the pheromone concoction on herself. Overcome with lust, Dr. Parker assaults her. Mrs. Parker tries to explain to the audience that while she clearly doesn't romanticize it at all, to say that he raped her isn't fair as well because he was under chemical control, but adds that it was the most painful experience of her life. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened later that night.
More? There's more?
We see young Meredith walking home alone, sobbing, when suddenly a bat flies down and attaches itself to her. She screams and pries it off, but another one swoops down and latches onto her as well. Then another. Then another. She struggles, but soon the bats are covering her entire body and she runs off screaming. Mrs. Parker explains that the bats were attracted to the pheromone and that they bit and burrowed everywhere, violating her as well.
I'm sorry, I just started hearing really loud circus music in my head. What did you say?
We then see young Meredith covered in bats running to her parents who try to help. Mrs. Parker says that she felt the bats release and that the horror was finally over. But then she saw the bats had gone for her parents instead. The next morning, Dr. Parker found Meredith barely alive, lying between the bodies of her parents.
Okay, that's also horrifying.
He took her in, still very much in love with her, but both were ashamed of what had transpired that night. 2 months later, Meredith learned she was pregnant, and Dr. Parker begged her to marry him, hoping she still loved him too. Mrs. Parker says that even though she knew she would never love him again, she didn't want her child to be without a father and accepted. They moved to Hope Falls for a fresh start, leaving the horrors behind them, or so they thought. The true horror was yet to come.
Oh God, what? What is it now?
We see young Meredith again in the hospital in labor. The doctor announces that she's given birth to a healthy baby girl. But before long, the doctor notices something else and tells Meredith, who's now in pain, to push again. Thinking it's just the placenta or something, the doctor gasps in horror and holds up the ugly, writhing bat baby. Mrs. Parker screams, "Kill it! Kill it!" and lights go out on the hospital room. Lights up on Dr. Parker out in the woods. He explains that the task fell to him. He's had to put down countless animals at work, so this shouldn't have been any different. He also hoped it would prove his love to Meredith. Mr. Parker lays the bundle in his arms down and raises his shovel to kill the thing, but he can't. He can't bring himself to kill what he believes is his creation. But knowing he could never bring it home, he left the child at the mouth of the cave, assuming predators would do what he could not. But he was wrong. The bats claimed the child as theirs and took him in.
Wow, that took a weird turn.
Back in the present day, Edgar now knows that he is indeed a beast and tells his mother she was right to want him dead. Mrs. Parker tries to convince him otherwise, while the calls for Edgar to be killed build in the crowd. But Edgar has decided he cannot be saved. He walks up to one of the men aiming a shotgun at him, daring him to fire. The sheriff again tries to defuse the situation, but the mob wants blood. Edgar snatches a knife from Dr. Parker's belt and the crowd jumps back, but Edgar hands the blade to Dr. Parker, asking to be killed. Edgar and the company sing, "I Imagine You're Upset."
Don't deny the obvious, such an ugly boy. Everywhere you put me, look what I destroy. You're not strung up by farmers or caged in by police. If you're not a coward, give me peace.
Dr. Parker raises the knife to strike, but just as before, he cannot. Edgar sighs. Dr. Parker has left him no choice. Edgar continues the song, telling Dr. Parker and the crowd about what happened with Shelley in the woods that night.
I smell her perfume and her sweat.
Oh my God.
Jesus! Look what a gift she gave me.
Is it true?
Almost enough to save me.
Yes!
And I imagine you're upset.
Oh my God.
But I would kill for her again. And do you know what she did then?
Stop!
She offered me her veins, she offered me her blood, she offered me everything.
Enraged, Dr. Parker throws Edgar to the ground and raises the knife to strike, but stops when he locks eyes with his wife. He says it's too much for him. When he looks at Edgar, all he sees is her eyes and how he lost her that night. And every day, those eyes remind him. He suddenly turns to Edgar and asks if he's hungry. Dr. Parker takes the knife and slashes his own throat. Edgar cannot resist and lunges at Dr. Parker, biting him and feeding. While being fed upon, Dr. Parker raises his knife again, stabbing Edgar in the back. Edgar bites down harder and Dr. Parker raises his knife and strikes again. But Meredith tries to save Edgar and pull him off of her husband, but Dr. Parker ends up stabbing Meredith in the back by accident.
Oh, no!
The husband and wife die and fall on either side of the wounded Edgar. Shelley runs to him and cradles his head and says, "Oh, my sweet boy." But Edgar says, "I am not a boy. I am an animal." And the Bat Boy dies. Shelley lifts her head to the audience, and her and the rest of the town sing a reprise of "Hold Me, Bat Boy."
Hold your bat boy, touch your bat boy. No more need to hide. Know your bat boy, love your bat boy. Don't deny your peace inside.
The end.
It's over!
The show opened Off-Broadway to great notices from the major papers and won the Outer Critics Circle Award for Best Off-Broadway Musical and Lortel Awards for Best Musical and Best Choreography for Mr. Gattelli. The show seemed to be destined to transfer to Broadway.
We may be going to Broadway.
So why then did it close on December 2nd, 2001 after only 260 performances? Well, as you may have guessed from the dates, the show was impacted, as was the whole world, by the events of September 11th, 2001. With tourism at a standstill, the show couldn't hang on and closed.
Well, shit.
I actually had tickets to see the show on one of my trips to New York before I lived here, but the show closed before I got to see it. Work on the Monster musical didn't cease there though. The show went across the pond in 2004, first playing the West Yorkshire Playhouse in Leeds before transferring to the West End at the Shaftesbury Theatre on September 8th, 2004. It again starred Deven in the title role with an all-new British cast. As I mentioned before, there were several changes made to the show, most notably in the score, with the song Hey Freak replacing the songs Ugly Boy and What You Wanna Do, and the song Mine All Mine replacing Inside Your Heart during the scene where Shelley offers her arm to Edgar.
We can be one at last.
Don't worry, I'll heal really fast. Shut up and we'll be fine. Long as you're mine.
All that I had is dead, but here's a brand new thread. You'll be my daily bread and wine.
The musical, described by the West Yorkshire Playhouse as a cross between Edward Scissorhands and My Fair Lady, which I love, did not receive the enthusiastic reviews it did in America, however, with one writer noting that the British critics were less kind to Bat Boy than the West Virginians in the show itself.
Not a joke, just a fact.
The musical closed in London on January 15th, 2005, a month earlier than expected. After that, the creators continued working on the show, further revising the material. In 2014, a production at Harvard University got the distinction of adding brand new changes and material, and that same year, a developmental reading was held, starring original cast member Kerry Butler, James Monroe Iglehart, and Jeremy Jordan in the title role.
I want to go to there.
The reading was held with the hopes of finally reaching Broadway, but obviously nothing came of it. As of now, at least. Here's hoping. What did you all think of the show? Let me know down in the comments. You know I love hearing from you guys. If you found some value in this video and want to help it succeed, please give this video a like. It really, really helps with the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe and all the other stuff YouTubers beg you to do all the time. And sharing this video with friends and family on the socials really does make a difference. Make sure you're following me on Twitter at @BWayGhostlight, where I do daily polls and other fun things there. I love to connect with fellow theater nerds on that platform.
On Twitter and YouTube's.
I'm also mulling over starting a Patreon, so if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, let me know what you'd like to see from me there. Thank you all so much for watching. You guys that stay to the very end are my absolute favorites. But until next time, this is Broadway by Ghostlight. I'm Mark Bonanni, and now it's time to feed.